Preparation pays off in many ways. We can't all have the single-minded dedication of an Alekhine. Few lives and few endeavors permit such devotion. But in truth, it's not the amount of time that really counts. It's the quality of your study and how you use your time. Becoming a 24/7 fanatic who counts every minute and second isn't going to make you a success. The keys to great preparation are self-awareness and consistency. Steady effort pays off, even if not always in an immediate, tangible way. One interesting and humbling thing I've noticed while analyzing my own games for publication is how poor some of the ideas I prepared really were. From the safety of retirement, I now look back at the huge amount of analysis I did in preparation for my tournaments and world championship matches. Only a fraction of these ideas ever saw the light of day, either because my opponent didn't fall into my trap, or because in the heat of battle I found a better variation to play. Now I see that in many cases that was not a bad thing. With the benefit of powerful computer programs, it becomes clear that instead of wielding Excalibur, I was in many cases preparing to charge the enemy with a rusty pocket knife. Still, this kind of preparation served me well in a way I never quite appreciated while I was working on it with such determination. These periods of intense preparation were rewarded with good results, even when I didn't end up utilizing the fruits of my labor. There was an almost mystical correlation between work and achievement, with no direct tie between them. Perhaps I was benefiting from the chess equivalent of the placebo effect. Going into battle with what I believed were lethal weapons gave me confidence, even though they went largely unused and wouldn't in some cases have been effective. There is also a practical benefit to such wasted effort. The research a lawyer does preparing for a case that never goes to trial still enriches his understanding of the law and makes him better at his job. Work leads to knowledge, and knowledge is never wasted. Even if our weapons remain sheathed, our opponents know they exist and may be distracted by the potential for nasty surprises. This ethic has been followed by many people known to history as great geniuses. We cannot doubt the brain power of Thomas Edison, but his true genius lay in his capacity for endless experimentation. In creating the electric light bulb, he tested thousands of substances to find a filament that wouldn't burn out, even working with rare plant fibers sent in from around the world. Opportunity, Edison said, is missed by most because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. This was an echo of another great thinker and worker, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote, "I'm a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the more I have of it." The worst of it is that we are usually aware of our deficiencies when it comes to practice and hard work. We criticize ourselves harshly after spending an hour at work surfing the web, or for leaving the gym bag by the door while we watch television. But of course, this self-flagellation produces no more benefit than those New Year's resolutions that rarely outlast the winter. Before you tell yourself you don't have the talent of a Jordan or an Alekhine, remember the extraordinary amount of time they devoted to practice and study. To succeed like them, you must put in the effort they did. Otherwise, you can never know what you're capable of. I believe that if opportunity isn't provided at a young age, it can be created later in adulthood through discipline and imaginative involvement in the pursuits we care about. You can and must look for ways to experiment and to push the boundaries of your capacity in different areas. Turning a game into a science. If Alekhine brought a new level of dedication, even obsession, to the game of chess, the man who succeeded him on the throne professionalized and codified this devotion. The first of the 7 Soviet champions, Mikhail Botvinnik, sought to demystify the game through his writing and teaching. Botvinnik's most lasting contributions to chess culture were in the area of preparation. Ever the engineer, he established detailed training regimens. These encompassed not only specific chess research, but also physical and psychological preparation. These methods are so commonplace now, it is hard to imagine a time when every player didn't do these things. But at the time, Botvinnik was a true innovator. His system involved researching the opening phase of the game, studying his opponent's styles, and rigorous analysis of his own games. which were published so they could be criticized by others. To give just one example of the extremes he would go to, during training sessions for a tournament, Botvinnik would have distracting music playing in the background, and even requested that one of his trainers blow smoke in his face. I was Botvinnik's favorite pupil at the chess academy, and I owe a great deal to him for adding focus and discipline to my natural aptitude. He taught me to avoid complexity for complexity's sake, saying, "You will never become an Alekhine if the variations control you and not the other way around." So Botvinnik laid out the ideal tournament regimen, establishing a strict timetable for meals, rest, and brisk walks, a system I followed my entire career. If you said you didn't have enough time, that meant you were not well organized. And forget about telling the great teacher you were tired that day. Sleep and rest were to be as carefully scheduled as training, and it was simply inexcusable to get insufficient rest. Botvinnik summed up his philosophy by stating, "The difference between man and animal is that man is capable of establishing priorities." I was lucky, because I had been well prepared for Botvinnik by my mother, Clara, who inherited a strong sense of the importance of order and routine from her family. For me, it was simply the way things were, and I always felt comfortable with it. Sleep, meals, school, study time, recreation time, all were part of a schedule. Of course, it was easier 30 years ago when I was growing up. There were fewer distractions available, fewer acceptable activities for a child, especially in the USSR. Today, distractions are virtually unlimited, and the computerized world makes instant entertainment ubiquitous and available to everyone. Mobile phones, video games, and gadgets allow us to waste time in a dozen different ways that don't usually add up to anything at all. With so much activity in their own lives, parents have few opportunities to teach, let alone demonstrate, rules and regimen, and to present a good example. I could observe the way my mother programmed her life and my activities, and I had no doubt it was all for the best. As I grew older and moved into the serious chess world as a young teenager, I continued to be surrounded by hard-working coaches and mentors. Botvinnik's words and examples strengthened what I had already learned from my mother. He provided the game plan, helping me to develop the routines and practices that reinforced a general ethic about hard work and dogged preparation. Now, though retired from professional chess, I stick with my routine as closely as possible. This means hours of sleep, meal times, hours of work on different projects, and staying conscious of how these things are balanced daily and weekly. I've adapted my new activities into the old chess program, preserving the patterns that have kept me comfortable and productive. Where there used to be chess, there is now politics. Where before I would analyze the games of my chess opponents, I now analyze the statements of my political opponents. My afternoon nap is still sacrosanct. Targeting ourselves for efficiency. Alekhine and Botvinnik, and later Bobby Fischer, had a talent for working constantly and effectively. They could keep pouring more energy and getting positive results back out. We can all work longer hours, study more, watch less TV, but the ability to remain effective under increasing strain varies from person to person. Everyone has a unique level of efficiency in his ratio of work to results. A Capablanca might be creative for an hour, but burn out after 2. An Alekhine might need 4 hours to get those same results, but is capable of working for 8 hours without a drop in productivity. It is critical to know what motivates you, to find out how to push yourself that extra mile. For me, it's sticking to a regimen. As long as I don't make exceptions to my program, I feel motivated. I also know that I need new challenges to stay engaged. The minute I begin to feel something has become repetitive or easy, I know it's time to quickly find a new target for my energy. Others use different devices, such as competition, setting goals, or using incentives. Anatoly Karpov was not by nature a hard worker, but he spent 10 to 12 hours a day preparing for his match with Boris Spassky in 1974. Karpov is tremendously competitive, and his will to win spurred him to new levels of effort. It paid off, and he beat Spassky convincingly. If discipline sounds dull or even impossible in today's fast-paced world, you should take a moment to consider how you might benefit from targeting just a few small areas of your life for efficiency. Having a good work ethic doesn't mean being a fanatic. It means being aware and then taking action. If you spend 15 minutes a day studying openings, in a year you'll be a stronger chess player. If you spend an hour a day learning Mandarin, in a few years you may be ready for an entirely different career. This isn't a cookbook, and I'm not offering a recipe for your success. Everyone must create his own successful combinations with the ingredients he has. There are guidelines for what works, but each person has to discover what works for him. This doesn't happen by itself. Through practice and observation, you must take an active role in your own education. With the fundamental ingredients behind us, we move now to the evaluation and analysis phase of decision-making. Knowing what to look for is only the first challenge. Good decisions require the ability to weigh all of the factors present and to decide the best balance among them. Part 2. Chapter 7. MTQ. Material, Time, Quality. Every chess player is familiar with the concepts of material, time, and quality. The balance among these three factors is the foundation of every move in chess and in every decision we make. Making a correct evaluation, and then a correct decision, requires understanding the trade-offs and relative values of these core elements. Material describes our tangible assets. Time is how long it takes to achieve a specific objective. Quality, the most important element, and a goal unto itself, is value, or even power. We strive to gain in every area, and also to invest and balance the factors correctly. Evaluation trumps calculation. It was a curious experience when I first tried to think seriously about what exactly goes through my mind when I look at a chess position. For me, chess is a language, and if it's not my native tongue, it is one I learned via the immersion method at a young age. Like a native English speaker trying to explain the difference between that and which, such familiarity makes it difficult for me to consider my approach to the game objectively. Now that I'm removed from the heat of battle and tournament play, I can look back at my games and performances with greater introspection and better understand what goes into strategic assessment. Improving your decision-making is like studying your native language. Even though most of us don't know much about the mechanics of the language we learned as children, that doesn't prevent us from speaking it fluently. But still, we all make mistakes. Incorrect grammar, words we use improperly, awkward sentences. Millions of books on more effective writing are sold every year to native speakers who recognize the value of communicating with greater precision. Similarly, with decision-making, we all have an apparatus that gets us through life. But there are still improvements that can, or as it may, be made. To do so requires conscious thought about something you've done unconsciously all your life. Since the day you started to crawl, you've been making countless choices. And like the rest of us, you've developed systems and tendencies that you employ instantly, constantly, without being the least bit conscious of them. We aren't going to overturn a lifetime of experience, nor would we want to. We need to start out by becoming aware of the processes that work for us, then move on to improving them step by step. What bad habits have you picked up in your decision-making? Which steps do you skip, and which do you overemphasize? Do your poor decisions tend to stem from bad information, poor evaluation, incorrect calculation, or a combination of these things? Material, the fundamental element. Few of us will ever lead a multinational corporation or run in a national election, but all of our routine daily decisions benefit from an improved process. The key to that is the ability to correctly assess and evaluate a situation. By becoming more aware of all the elements, all the factors in play, we train ourselves to think strategically, or as we say in chess, positionally. Evaluating a position goes well beyond looking for the best move. The move is only the result, the product of an equation that must first be imagined and developed. So determine the relevant factors, measure them, and most critically, determine the optimal balance among them. Before you can begin your search for the keys to a position, You have to perform this basic due diligence. We can categorize these factors into 3 groups: material, time, and quality. The simplest and perhaps most important area to evaluate is material. Assets, stock, cash, goods, pieces and pawns. It's all material. In chess, the first thing we do when we look at the board is count the pieces. How many pawns? How many knights and rooks? Do I have more or less material than my opponent? When we first learn the game, we are all terrible materialists. We capture as many enemy pieces as we can without paying much attention to other factors. A game between 2 beginners can look more like Pac-Man than chess, as the 2 competitors gobble up each other's pieces. This is a normal and healthy way to start out. Being told the values is one thing, but only experience really teaches you what those values signify in the real world of chess. In other areas, too, most of our objective measurements of success and failure come down to material. On a basic personal level, that means food, water, and shelter. Now that we as a society can express value electronically, it might be an account balance, or stocks, or funds in banks. In warfare, it's which side has more soldiers, more guns, more ships. In business, it's factories, employees, stock, cash on hand. It isn't always easy to assess the true value of material. We all have personal attachments to certain assets that have little to do with their objective value. These sentimental attachments can distort your evaluation ability considerably, if not always in a harmful way. When I was a child, my favorite piece was the bishop, for no reason I can remember today. Even in my earliest games, I was a great believer in the power of the bishop, and I avoided their exchange at all cost, a habit that often proved detrimental. Other beginners might be attracted to the unusual leaping ability of the knight, or alternatively develop a fear of this most unpredictable piece. A significant part of Botvinnik's intensive research of his opponents was dedicated to discovering such biases in their play. He would comb through their games looking for errors, then try to categorize them in a way he could later exploit. In his teachings, Botvinnik made it clear that the worst type of mistake was one produced due to a bad habit, because it made you predictable. Our friends, colleagues, and family usually know much more about our bad habits than we do. Hearing about these psychological tics can be as surprising as being told by your spouse that you snore. Prejudices and preferences in your decisions are unlikely to be harmful as long as you are aware of them and actively work to iron them out. Awareness can mean the difference between a harmless habit and a bias that leads to a dangerous loss of objectivity. It doesn't take long in chess or any other pursuit to realize that there is much more to life than material. The first time you are checkmated despite having a big material advantage, you've learned an important lesson. The ultimate value of the king trumps everything else on the board, and your value system begins to adjust. You realize that other factors can be even more important. Time is money. Anyone who has ever worked for an hourly wage knows that in the most basic sense, time has value. Your employer exchanges material, money, for labor, as measured by the hours you work. This is clock time, measured and understood in the same way everywhere. It is quite different from what chess players call board time, which is the number of steps it takes to accomplish an objective. Chess players are used to thinking of both types of time during a game. Your clock is ticking, and you have a limited amount of time to make all your moves, clock time. Then you have the game itself, where time is divided neatly into moves, alternating between you and your opponent. How many moves does it take to get from point A to point B? How long will it take for my knight to threaten his queen? Can I reach my objective before my opponent reaches his? That is board time. And as I hope to show, success in every kind of enterprise requires the ability to understand and use both sorts of time to your advantage. The simplest way to demonstrate this is to look at the difference between playing white and black. White goes first, putting him a single move ahead at the start, giving him an advantage in board time. It is a matter of historical debate whether the advantage of the first move should prove enough to force a win for whites if both sides play perfectly. As humans, we are so far from perfect that this can never be proven. Among amateurs, who are more likely to make errors and wasteful moves, the narrow advantage of that single move at the start is rarely decisive. But among professionals, being one move ahead is a tangible plus. With precise play, that single move allows White to apply pressure and make threats against Black's position. White is acting. Black is reacting. Statistics bear out the value of the first move. At the Grandmaster level, White wins 29% of the time, Black 18%, and 53% of games are drawn. But if White takes too long to decide his moves, he can find himself rushing decisions at the end of the game to avoid defaulting. That is, he might squander his advantage in board time due to a disadvantage in clock time. A military commander is used to thinking of time in the same way as a chess player, but in the real world, things are much more dynamic. There is practically no limit to the number of moves you and your enemy can make at the same time. Multiple attacks and counterattacks can take place concurrently around the battlefield or around the world. But the definition of time remains the same, because in both cases, what matters is how quickly an objective can be achieved, whether it be on the battlefield or the chessboard. Time is not gained just by moving faster or by taking shortcuts. Time can often be bought or swapped for material assets. Think of it as paying extra money, material, for express delivery, time. Time for material is the first of the trade-offs in our evaluation system. When is it worth material to achieve an objective, and how much material to invest? How do we know we are getting our material's worth in time? When time matters most. No one understood the value of time and material better than Mikhail Tal. The first time I saw Tal in person, I was 10 years old, and while his year as world champion had come and gone before I was born, his thrilling games were the favorite of every schoolboy. Tal was the ultimate time player. When his attacking genius was in full flight, his pieces seemed to move not just better, but somehow faster than his opponents. How was this possible? The young Tal cared much less for material than most players, and would happily give up almost any number of pawns and pieces in exchange for more time to bring his other forces into action against the enemy king. He constantly pushed his opponents onto the defensive, leading to errors and disaster. This sounds simple, but few have been able to imitate Tal's unique gift for knowing just how far he could go, and few would dare give up as much material as he would. It's easy to see that when you're attacking, being a move ahead is more important than material. But how much more important? Is one move worth 2 pawns, or 2 moves worth a bishop? There is no simple value chart for time, only case-by-case evaluation. Ask a general if he would rather have another company of men or an extra few days. During peacetime, he'd rather have the men, while in a guerrilla combat situation, the extra time could be much more valuable. In chess, we talk about open positions and closed positions. An open position has many clear lines for your pieces, more options to move in different directions, and more opportunities for attack and counterattack. A closed position usually means a slow, strategic maneuvering game, the chess equivalent of trench warfare. In an open game, the value of a move is much greater than in a closed game, because a single attack can do much more damage. If a position is blocked and there is little activity overall, there is less need for speed. These factors occur in business as well. Imagine that you own a company that is working on a new product line. You know a competitor is working on a similar project and is at around the same stage in development. Should you rush your products to market to beat Company B? Or should you spend more money on development to try to ensure your product is superior to Company B's? Of course, the answers always depend on real-world factors, so recognizing what sort of situation we are in is a crucial part of the evaluation. Before you start considering trade-offs, take a good look around. What industry are these companies in? What type of product is it? Time is always a factor, but is it really of the essence in this case, or are you just being impatient? Putting a new heart medicine on the market isn't the same as trying to get the latest gadget out in time for Christmas shoppers. What's important is recognizing the exchange between time and material. My third World Championship match with Anatoly Karpov presents a wonderfully clear example of this constant fluctuation. It was the 8th game of our 1986 match, which was split between London and Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was still known at the time. Searching for an advantage, I offered Karpov a pawn in exchange for the opportunity to attack his king, judging that the 2 moves I would gain against his king were worth the price of a pawn on the other side of the board. Karpov had done the same math, and after his evaluation, he captured the pawn. My attack quickly built up steam until it was Karpov's turn to offer material in order to organize a defense of his king. He exposed his rook to my bishop. Taking it would give me a slight material advantage, but at the cost of abandoning my attack and allowing him to consolidate his position. This was a classic example of the fluidity in the factors of material and time as they played a role in both of our games. I gave up material for attacking time, and later Karpov offered the material back to gain time for his defense. I declined the offer, not wanting to go from lender to borrower so quickly. It's worth noting that Karpov, as a matter of style, would certainly have taken the material had our positions been reversed. Taking the rook guaranteed a small advantage with no risk, exactly the sort of situation Karpov enjoyed. I ignored the rook and instead continued on, down a pawn, looking for a way to break through. A few moves later, I even gave up another pawn to keep my attack alive, even though this meant I was likely to lose if my attack didn't succeed. As so often happens, an advantage in board time, pressure and threats that force your opponent to react, results in an advantage in clock time. Move after move, Karpov had to burn a lot of time finding his way through all the dangers to his king. With 10 moves still to go until we got more time added to our clocks, Karpov lost on time, a nearly unprecedented event in his long career. This game serves as a testament to my philosophy of preferring time over material, favoring dynamic factors over static factors. These evaluation preferences are part of one style and aren't necessarily superior or inferior to those of others, only different. Karpov lost that game. Does that mean he was wrong in his evaluation of the position? Or that I was right? Neither. In another situation, material might have triumphed over time. What's important here is to recognize these factors at play. The third factor, quality. Each piece in chess has a standard value that allows us to quickly add up who's ahead in the arms race. Our standard of measurement, our basic currency, is the pawn. Each player starts with 8 of these foot soldiers, the most limited and least valuable members of the army. Even the word pawn has come to connote weakness and expendability. We even say pawns and pieces, not including them in the same class as bishops, knights, and rooks. Pawns provide a useful system of equivalent value. Knights and bishops are said to be worth 3 pawns. Rooks are 5 pawns, while the queen is worth 9. The king, whose capture ends the game, is weak, but priceless. So informed, a beginner can go into battle knowing that he shouldn't give up a knight for a pawn, or a rook for a knight. But for the experienced player, much more goes into the evaluation of a position than counting pieces and moves. The piece values fluctuate depending on your position and can change after every turn. The same is true about the value of a move, unless we believe Tall's knights really were faster. Material is the fundamental reference point. Time is movement and action. To be correctly understood and utilized, the 2 elements must be governed by a third element, quality. Generations of platitudes teach us that there is good money and bad. There is even the entrenched notion of quality time. In chess, we talk about a weak knight or a particularly strong pawn because their value changes depending on their placement and on other factors. A knight located in the center of the board, where it controls more territory and can join the fight in any region, is almost always more valuable than one near the edge of the board, a concept that is immortalized in the old chess maxim, "A knight on the rim is dim." On the real field of battle as well, all terrain is not equally valued. Throughout the history of warfare, Combatants have sought the highest ground available. From the heights, your archers, and later your artillery, can shoot farther, and your commanders can better see the battle develop. Satellites and air power have changed these ancient equations in many ways, but it will always be true that where your forces are placed can be as important as their strength in numbers. Placement provides or limits utility, which is what the commander, or the business executive, or the chess player seeks. What makes a bad bishop bad? We often talk about having a good bishop or a bad bishop, and understanding how this can be provides insight into the subtle but essential differences in the materials that we work with every day. My childhood favorite, the bishop, called an elephant in Russian and a fool in French, is a good example because of the way its movement is limited. The bishop can travel as many squares as it likes in any diagonal direction, but on only one color of the board. This gives it great range, but makes it predictable. If many of the squares of the bishop's color are occupied by pawns of the same color, its mobility is extremely limited. Such a bishop is called bad, but its intrinsic nature is no different from when the game started. Its quality has been diminished by the circumstances around it. From a practical standpoint, that of utility, it is inferior and should be considered as such. If I have a bad bishop, I would be glad to trade it off for another piece. The CEO and the general have to be alert to bad pieces in their worlds as well. When Jack Welch took over the behemoth that was General Electric in 1981, one of the first things he did was to make a list of all the divisions in the company that weren't performing up to his standards. The directors of those operations were told they had to improve or their divisions would be sold or closed down. Instead of hanging on to units solely for their presumed material value, GE would focus on what it was best at and cut back in the areas where it wasn't doing well. Any chess master would recognize Welch's strategy as employing the principle of improving your worst piece. He was applying Tarrasch's dictum, one badly placed piece makes your whole position bad. If you have a bad bishop, you try to find a way to activate it, to make it good. If it can't be rehabilitated, you try to swap it off or eliminate it. The same is true of ineffective material in any business or enterprise. Put that bad piece, that underperforming asset, to good use or get rid of it, and your overall position will improve. Returning to our stock portfolios, we can see why the same strategies don't always apply. Any good investment counselor will tell you to keep a balanced portfolio with a mix of risky and stable assets depending on your age, needs, and income. If you constantly sell the things that aren't performing well at the moment, you will inevitably be out of position at some point, and it could happen at a crucial juncture when you have everything to lose. Putting the elements into action. Only in extreme cases can material in chess be completely inert and worthless. A knight that is trapped in the corner may someday escape and play a critical role in the fight. One of the difficulties programmers have in improving computer chess programs is the concept of never and how it relates to the value of material. Even a weak human player can see that a piece has permanently been trapped and is therefore worthless. But to a computer, that piece still has the same numeric value in its calculations as before it was trapped. Perhaps some points are deducted for loss of mobility, but there is no good way to teach a computer that a bishop on square X is worth 3 pawns, but on square Y, it's only worth 1. This gives us different classes of material, long-term and dynamic. Investment portfolios work much the same way. Depending on personal style and needs, your portfolio might be full of dynamic, liquid assets, which require constant attention and reassessment. Or the portfolio might be aimed at long-term growth and preservation of capital, bonds, for a retirement that is still decades off. My play in the aforementioned game with Karpov showed my preference for dynamism and his for the long term. I sacrificed pawns to make my remaining material more valuable in the short run. Had my attack failed, his investment in long-term material advantages would have won the day. This was a typical theme of many of my games against Karpov, thanks to our different natures regarding time and material. In our first World Championship match, my skills were not so well developed, and Karpov's material advantage deflected my attacks. His evaluations were superior, but by the London match, a year and a half later, I had learned to be less rash with giving away material, and it was a different story. Double-edged evaluation. Who is winning is a simple enough question, but real evaluation is a complex undertaking. First, we count material. If one player has a significant advantage here, we can say he is winning, unless his opponent has compensated in time and/or quality. Whose forces are better developed and placed more aggressively? How quickly can one side attack and the other defend? How long will it take for reinforcements to arrive? Who commands more territory? Is someone's king in danger? These are all qualitative evaluations, and each carries a different degree of significance. One way to illustrate the relative nature of qualitative evaluations, the type that leaders in every enterprise must do each day, is to examine the qualities of a group of pawns on a chessboard. Think of a chessboard. You don't even need to know how to move the pieces. Take an example of white and black pawns on a chessboard. Both sides have the full contingent of 8, so they are equal in material. The qualitative difference here is structure, the form the pawns take as a group. Let's say whites are orderly and form a complete wall across the board. Blacks are fragmented into 3 islands. In 2 cases, one black pawn stands in front of another, limiting its mobility. Thus, we would say that white has a superior pawn structure. In that, we would be correct, and the game would be simple if there were no pieces or kings. But in a real game, the pawn structure would be just one factor in evaluating the position. The holes between the black pawns could possibly benefit black, giving him compensation for his inferior structure. A chess player who likes long-term static advantages, such as a solid structure, would undoubtedly prefer to play the white side. But show such a position to the great David Bronstein, who challenged Botvinnik for the world title in 1951, and he would surely prefer black. Like me, Bronstein was a dynamic player who always favored short-term activity over long-term considerations. Here, he would be content to have those structural holes, because he would use them to activate his pieces. I tend to look at structure in chess as a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways, depending on what kind of a player you are. Only the truly accomplished strategist will be able to see how and why the concept of structure works this way in the situations he faces every day. Finer double-edged factors, such as structure, come into focus only when the forces are evenly matched in the essential areas. The stronger the players, and the more balanced the game, the more the evaluation comes down to the tiniest details. While major differences in material and time are relatively obvious, distinctions in these more subtle criteria only show under great pressure, and it is the mark of a great player to be able to detect and exploit them. The saying goes that the devil is in the details, and these secondary factors are the chess player's devils. Any police officer can follow a thief's footsteps in the snow, but Sherlock Holmes could deduce an amazing amount from clues invisible to others. Personal return on investment. What are the smaller issues that can have a big impact on our lives? Few of us need to worry about food and water, yet we obsess over material things as much as our ancestors. The higher concepts of utility, quality, and happiness sound too vague and philosophical to think about. We think about time as something not to waste, not as something to invest. Our pursuit of education provides an elegant rebuttal to that idea. What is going to college if not an investment of material and time for quality? We give time and money to gain skills that will raise our intrinsic value to an employer. Higher education is one way we, or our parents, make material sacrifices to increase the quality of our position in the future. The more we can afford to invest, the greater our return will be. If you have the money and grades to go to a top university, you will be able to gain a superior education, make better contacts, and be better positioned to enter the job market. Perhaps a more openly mercenary path, getting an MBA, offers a clearer example. An executive making $100,000 a year decides to leave a good job and spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to go back to school. By all accounts, going to business school isn't much fun, so short-term enjoyment isn't a motive. Considering the investment of time and material, the qualitative return must be judged to be high since business school enrollments continue to rise. That return in quality comes in the shape of skills and contacts, which then lead to a better job. Higher pay and more responsibility enhance the new MBA's quality of life, or at least that's the way the formula is supposed to work. Certainly many people with business degrees are unhappy. A new high-paying job might take up so much time that none is left for activities that are significant components of happiness. The difficulty is in being aware of these small factors and evaluating them before we make a decision that affects them. The questions we must ask are not only about trade-offs. Giving up material doesn't always result in a gain of time, or vice versa. At least in chess, you can have it all or lose it all. The player with a winning position will usually have more pieces and be ahead in time and have superior placement and position. Consider this the rich grow richer variation. A politician on the campaign trail is seeking happiness by way of winning the election. The candidate has a limited amount of time and a limited amount of money. His strategy is predicated on using these things to give the biggest possible boost to his image in the eyes of the electorate. Although a huge amount of money is spent on campaigns, now more than ever, experience shows that subtle elements can still surprise. A single soundbite or gaffe can shift perception dramatically, for better or for worse. Dan Quayle's mangling of the spelling of the word potato in front of a classroom full of kids while on the campaign trail mangled his political career forever. However, such things only rarely overcome more fundamental advantages and disadvantages. MTQ on the home front. These exchanges between material, time, and quality are just as powerful in our personal lives. For example, my wife Dasha and I recently bought a new home, an ordeal that for me involved no fewer considerations and no less stress than playing in a world championship match. Anyone who has bought a home or even rented an apartment knows how many trade-offs are involved. They go well beyond the obvious ones of material versus quality. Even if you believe that you get what you pay for, and the more you pay, the better house you'll get, figuring out precisely what better means is complex, especially if you have a family, which increases the number of decisions and the number of decision makers. The same cliché rules in both real estate and chess. Location, location, location. Where you live is as important as what you live in. If you have children, you'll want to be near a school. If you work long hours, you'll want to be near your office. In any case, you'll want a neighborhood that's safe, convenient to shopping and entertainment, and so on. These are the obvious qualities people look for. We have equivalent guidelines in chess, too. Play in the center. Get your king to safety quickly. These rules of thumb serve as useful guides for beginners, but as players advance, they begin to detect the occasional exceptions to the rules, and capitalizing on these exceptions is what separates a great player from a good one. There is no universal formula for evaluation. We get caught up in standardized rhetoric and end up with something that doesn't fit our unique needs. For the most part, we all know what we like and make decisions accordingly. But under pressure, we can easily be confused and lose sight of our goals. The little things are hard to keep in mind when there are so many big things. So it's no surprise that the small stuff causes the most problems. Many fail by overdependence on the areas they best understand. It is comforting to stick to what you know, and you are often unaware that a problem can be seen from a different perspective. If you are so focused on just one aspect of a situation, if you fall blindly in love with your bishops, or that corner office, or that big tree in the backyard, you will almost certainly make mistakes in your evaluation. While you can have it all in chess, and perhaps even in life, that elision condition is not useful for learning. Most of the time, we will have to balance, exchange, and evaluate over and over. If we do this well enough to blend material, time, and quality into a multidimensional evaluation, we gain a clear idea of what we want and can then plan on how to achieve it. When we see all the factors, we can then learn how to shift them and build them. Without expanding our powers of evaluation, we risk fulfilling Oscar Wilde's famous observation about knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. Material is only as valuable as the use it can be put to. Time for action is only important if it helps us make our material more useful. Most people would welcome having an extra hour in the day, but not the man in a jail cell. The message here is, use time to improve your material, not just acquire more of it. Material for its own sake is as useless as wasted time in the pursuit of our goals. Useful material and well-spent time lead to winning in a chess game. In the corporate world, they lead to higher revenues. In war and politics, they lead to victory. And I might add that in everyday life, victory can simplistically, perhaps a little romantically, be defined as happiness. Money can't buy it, after all. But I believe that by using your time wisely, you can put all your material to your best advantage and achieve the ultimate goal of quality. That's the promise of the material time quality concept in chess and in life. Chapter 8: Exchanges and Imbalances. Freezing the game. An imbalance is any lack of symmetry that can be exploited to one's advantage. In chess, this refers to the quantitative and qualitative differences between your opponent's forces and your own. A game may appear to be deadlocked, but when you play like a master and diligently consider all three MTQ factors, imbalances always exist, because even if the pieces are completely symmetrical on the board, it is always someone's turn. The player whose move it is has an advantage in time, which breaks the balance. Suspending the game in time is a useful way to teach students how to evaluate qualitative factors such as structure and space. We do this by showing a chess position without revealing whose move it is. At first, this sounds preposterous. If the entire purpose is to decide the best move, isn't it essential to know whose move it is? The purpose of this technique is precisely to remove the anxiety about choosing the next move and to encourage the player to appreciate the subtle elements in play across the board without prejudice. This technique taught students to better consider the various destinations and to evaluate them thoroughly instead of focusing on where to go. In real play, the students immediately start making suggestions for the next move, trying one after another without thinking things through, and they tend to miss the big picture and the strategic possibilities that are present at each move. I experienced a similar syndrome when I ventured into the business of the Internet. In 1999, my partners and I were getting ready to launch a giant Internet chess portal bearing my name. As the site neared completion, the designers worked with testers and focus groups to see how well the design and navigation worked in practice. It was tragic-comic to watch the testers completely ignore the signs and instructions that had carefully been worked out by my team and me, and deliberately placed by the web designers. Instead, following what the experts told me is the normal pattern, the users would immediately click on whatever caught their eye, and if unhappy with the results, jump back and try again. Or they'd go off in a totally different direction. They ignored most of the menu choices we had worked so hard to perfect. The desire to be quick and to keep moving forward drove them. Unfortunately, this reflects how many of us go about making decisions all the time. We take our best guess and plunge forward, barely considering the options before us. There is a huge difference between just browsing the possible moves and evaluating the situation. Frequently, our intuitive leaps prove fruitful, and for at least a short time, we get what we want and need. But my years as a chess player have taught me how important it is to do the analysis that will clearly show you which of the options is superior. Instinctive evaluation is better than none at all, but we can't confuse it with understanding, even if the results aren't always bad. For example, getting back to those beginning chess students, what if one of them, through intuition or luck or both, hurriedly calls out the right move when presented with a position to analyze. It's to his credit, but it doesn't mean he really understands the position, and it may lead to the formation of bad habits. Only a deliberate analysis leads us to the core of the position. This, in turn, narrows our options and informs our decisions. That's when we reintroduce the time factor and use our evaluation to decide on the best move. This isolation technique is utilized in business schools to train students in various methods of evaluating a company or a case study. To start out, the class might be given only a balance sheet with no knowledge of the competition, perhaps even of the industry, or they might be shown only the market share of the company's products relative to the competition. Introducing elements one by one attempts to eliminate gaps in education and evaluation habits. When students have the full picture, they can see how all the elements combine to form a single, unique image. Once we have frozen play, we still have to know what to analyze and how to weigh that analysis. On a chessboard, the number of factors to consider is limited, but the number of ways to consider them is unlimited. As we discussed earlier, even strong players will differ over the relative importance of the different elements. The simplest test is to present a position and ask someone which side he would prefer to play, white or black. Who is better and why? The position may be equal, but a human being is a creature of preference and can never be completely objective. Being aware of your preferences and prejudices can be as critical as how well you observe the external factors. We can move our theoretical chess position to the military battlefield or the corporate boardroom. Before a general launches an attack, he evaluates as many factors as he can. He must consider terrain, weather, force readiness, supply lines, political support, and dozens of other things before he makes his move. Successful companies focus on long-term goals established by accurate evaluation. A CEO can't be ruled by a perceived need to respond immediately to every move the competition makes, or he won't have any real strategy of his own. The search for compensation. A proper evaluation is a search for advantage or compensation for disadvantage. Few advantages are unconditional, and most disadvantages, like clouds, come with a silver lining. Tarrasch was exaggerating only slightly when he wrote, "Every move creates a weakness." Unless a move delivers checkmate, it has negatives as well as positives. The same is true of static characteristics. For example, when your pawns advance, you gain space to maneuver your pieces, but at the expense of weakening your defenses. When troops advance, lines of communication and supply can be cut or become disorganized. Material losses are typically the only purely negative factor, although in extreme cases you might benefit by losing a member of your own forces. If an army's fast-moving cavalry is hemmed in by its own foot soldiers, a general can't just sacrifice his slower-moving troops. But in chess, it's not uncommon to play a clearance sacrifice by throwing a pawn into the teeth of the enemy to clear the lines for your pieces to advance. If an asset is nearly worthless and has no prospects of improvement, you might as well get what you can for it while you can. Amateurs who dabble in the stock market are famous for holding on to losing stocks all the way to the bottom, imagining that they haven't really lost anything until they've sold, which is a self-destructive fallacy. The cold-blooded investor knows that getting something now is better than nothing later. At a tournament in Yugoslavia in 1983, I had the opportunity to dispose of some falling shares in the form of a bishop. In my game against the leading Hungarian player, I was straining to find a way to exploit my slight lead in development. I wanted to use this dynamic advantage to launch an attack on his king. The problem was, all of my pieces needed to use the same central square. If I played my knight there, it would block my bishop, cutting it out of the game entirely. This led me to wonder, if the bishop wasn't participating actively at this exact moment in the game, why couldn't I exchange it for something of value in the black position, such as the pawn right in front of the black king? Giving up a bishop for a single pawn doesn't make any sense from a material perspective, but I had the initiative, an advantage in board time, and it was more time I needed. That is, my pieces were close to reaching key targets before my opponent could defend them. With a little more speed, they would crash home with decisive effect. To gain that board time, I invested more material. The bishop would otherwise be unemployed in my planned operation, and this way it could be sacrificed to further increase my dynamic advantage. I gave up the bishop, and with his king exposed, the Hungarian player had to lose more time running for cover. Eventually, my activity overwhelmed his material lead. In chess, as in life, we total up the pluses and minuses in a position, then go to work figuring out how to improve our side of the ledger. We want to create weaknesses in our opponent's camp, while strengthening our own. Essential to this is turning our weaknesses into strengths, or at least minimizing them. A theoretical weakness, a by-the-book disadvantage that can't be exploited by your opponent, is really not a weakness at all. Successfully exploiting your advantages leads to greater advantages, eventually great enough to win a decisive amount of material. This is where the alchemy comes in, the transformation of one type of advantage into another. With accurate play, we can turn material into time and back again, or invest both for a high return in quality. The laws of thermodynamics, chess, and quality of life. The first law of thermodynamics tells us that the total amount of energy in a system is constant, that if we move energy into one area, we lose an equal amount from another. To put it another way, energy can't spontaneously be created or destroyed, only transferred from one place to another, or transmuted from one form into another. On the chessboard, we try to break that law, to create both energy and material. If a pawn reaches the other side of the board, it can be promoted into any piece, even another queen. Of course, you can't have another king. In chess, bigamy is acceptable, but monarchy is absolute. That way we improve, we add to the energy of our own pieces. Of course, in a typical game of attack and counterattack, our opponent does the same thing, marshalling his forces and increasing his activity level, which is what makes the game dynamic. If done right, each chessboard transformation increases the quality of our position. In exchange for time, say 2 moves, I can bring my knight over to a superior location, and in so doing, I've increased that knight's energy, his power to do harm. Or when I sacrifice a pawn, my opponent has to lose a move or two to capture it, giving me time to augment my attack. Again, the material time quality concept forms the basic law of chess. A company can and should view its own playing field in a similar way. An advantage in cash reserves, material, is turned into research on new products, or employee bonuses, or more advertising, or a modernized factory. Looking at the assets of your competitors enables you to find imbalances you can exploit. Even if your opponent dominates in many areas, you can try to develop a positive imbalance of your own and displace some energy. If we can detect or cultivate a weak spot in our opponent's position, we can then attempt to transform our position to take advantage of that weakness. Here's an example from the world of technology. Strategy on the browser battlefield. The expression browser war was in wide use in the late 90s, when Netscape and Microsoft were battling for web market share. Netscape Navigator was first and also best. Microsoft Explorer lagged way behind in just about every respect. Its early versions were mediocre, and Navigator had a large and loyal customer base. In response, Microsoft developed a masterful strategy of exchanges. It had negative qualitative imbalances in product quality, user base, and brand recognition. But this war wasn't just browser versus browser. It was company versus company. And here, Microsoft had some positive imbalances against Netscape. First, it had a massive material advantage in cold, hard cash, thanks to the success of its Office suites and operating system software. Second, Microsoft had a placement advantage. It could bundle Explorer with its other popular software. If you bought Windows or MS Office, the Microsoft browser came installed on your computer. Microsoft didn't just give the browser away with other software. Leveraging its massive amount of cash, it simply gave it away to everybody free. This was a brutally efficient exchange of material for positional quality, and it worked wonderfully. To be fair, they also invested a lot of money into improving the quality of the Explorer browser. But that wasn't the most important factor in the race with Navigator. The much smaller Netscape saw what was going on and tried to keep up. They also cried foul and went to the courts to try to stop or at least slow Microsoft's appropriation of their energy in the browser wars. But such a small company couldn't afford to give its main product to everyone for free and still maintain quality. Netscape's attempts to bundle Navigator with other software were futile in the face of the 95% desktop dominance of Windows. Within 2 years, Microsoft went from less than a 10% share of the browser market to over 80%. They continued to gain until Netscape, and all the other competition, was entirely marginalized. Microsoft exploited its overwhelming advantage in resources. In American Civil War terms, it played General Grant to the rest of the software world's General Lee. The Union's Grant wasn't the most brilliant tactician, but he knew he would eventually wear down the Southern Army by sheer weight of troops and supplies. A war of attrition suited Grant, if not his men, just fine, and he had the brutally pragmatic nature needed to win such a war. With some stretching, we can even make an analogy to the Cold War. By constantly increasing military spending, the USA eventually bankrupted the USSR, which couldn't keep up the pace of spending, although in this case, the communist side also suffered from the fatal bug of a bankrupt ideology. All change comes at a cost. When measuring imbalances, you should consider the elements of your operation not just in relation to your rivals, but also in relation to one another. In chess, we talk about having harmony in our position. Are your pieces working together? Is your material developed in accordance with your strategic goals? The difficulty of achieving successful coordination increases with the number of assets. The corporate mega-mergers of the past decade illustrate this well. Time Warner and AOL came together in a deal of record proportions in 2001, and investors are now considering separating the companies again. Bigger isn't always better, especially if it comes at the cost of coordination. The chess bishop can move only diagonally, meaning each bishop spends its entire life on the squares of one color, white or black. Each player starts the game with 2 bishops, and the bishop pair can attack or defend any square on the board. When they work side by side, 2 bishops can be a devastating attacking force. This is why when one bishop is captured, often the other is greatly diminished as well. The remaining bishop can target only half the squares on the board, so your opponent knows he is safe on those squares, at least from the bishop. The combined power of the bishop pair is far greater than the sum of its parts. Similarly, 2 companies might combine to be worth far more than they were before, if they can work together in harmony. Or, as in the case of Time Warner and AOL, they might turn out to be worth less because of conflicts.